The doorbell rang at 7 in the morning on a Saturday I'd planned to spend forgetting my marriage existed. I was 3 weeks into sleeping on my brother's couch in Portland, nursing lukewarm coffee in a divorce I didn't see coming, when Margaret Chen stood on the porch with red eyes and an envelope that would crack open 15 years of lies. She didn't say hello. She said I'm sorry, and I knew my life was about to get worse before it got better. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is David Walsh. I'm 38 years old, a civil engineer who designs water treatment systems for municipalities across the Pacific Northwest. I'm the kind of man who color codes his file folders, keeps a rain jacket in the trunk year-round, and believes in fixing things properly the first time. I grew up in Eugene, learned to frame houses with my grandfather, and married the woman I thought I'd grow old beside. Her name was Claire Chen, and for 13 years, I believed we were building something that mattered. We met at a community fundraiser when I was 23 and she was 21. She volunteered at the registration table with a smile that made tired donors feel like heroes. I was there installing temporary lighting for the outdoor stage, and she brought me lemonade during a break I hadn't taken yet. We talked about her classes at Portland State and my new job with the county. She laughed at my bad jokes about load-bearing walls and seemed genuinely interested when I explained the difference between potable and graywater systems. By the end of the night, I had her number written on the back of an event program I still keep in a drawer I don't open anymore. Our courtship was the kind people describe as wholesome. Coffee dates that turned into bookstore wandering. Hikes through Forest Park where we'd stop to identify birds neither of us actually knew. She studied graphic design and showed me her portfolio in a cafe that smelled like cinnamon and ambition. I showed her blueprints of the water main project I was helping to plan, and she pretended to understand my excitement about pipe diameter and flow rates. What mattered was that we showed up for each other. We asked questions. We remembered answers. When I proposed on a rainy Thursday at the Japanese garden, she cried and said yes before I finished the question. We married the following spring in a ceremony small enough to feel intimate and large enough to honor both our families. Margaret, Claire's mother, welcomed me with the kind of warmth that felt earned, not performed. She hugged me after the vows and whispered that I was the answer to prayers she'd been saying since Claire was 16. I didn't understand what she meant then. I thought it was just the grateful relief of a mother watching her daughter marry someone stable. Looking back, I hear different words in that sentence. Prayers said in the dark. Prayers born from worry that runs deeper than wedding day nerves. We bought a small bungalow in the Selwood neighborhood, a place with good bones and a kitchen that needed updating. I renovated it room by room, learning the tile and wire and patch as I went. Claire painted an accent wall in the bedroom a soft sage green and hung prints from local artists we'd discovered at Saturday markets. We hosted dinners where friends brought wine and stories, and we'd linger at the table long after the food was gone. Our life had a rhythm. Weekday mornings meant her at the design studio and me at the county office. Evenings meant cooking together while a podcast played, her chopping vegetables while I managed the stove. Weekends were farmers markets, trail runs, brewery visits where we'd split a flight and debate which IPA had the best finish. Money wasn't extravagant, but it worked. We saved for a new roof, a better car, the occasional long weekend at the coast. Claire freelanced on the side, picking up branding projects for small businesses that couldn't afford agencies. I took on consulting gigs that let me work from home and stay close. We talked about kids someday, about a bigger house with a yard for a dog and a garden we'd actually tend. Those conversations felt real, like blueprints we were both committed to building. I never questioned whether we wanted the same things. I assumed alignment because the surface stayed smooth. What I missed were the small gaps forming in the foundation. The way Claire started working late more often, texts replacing calls, her laptop screen angling away when I walked into the room. She joined a new gym and came home energized in a way that felt less about endorphins and more about something I wasn't part of. Her phone developed a password I didn't know, and when I asked casually, she said it was for work security. I nodded because I trusted her, and trust doesn't interrogate every new lock. She started talking about a coworker named Ethan who was funny and sharp and helped her land a big client. I was happy for her. I didn't know I should be worried. The slide was gradual, the kind you don't notice until you're already halfway down. Date nights became rare, then theoretical, then something we joked about needing to schedule but never did. Conversations grew transactional. Did you pay the electric bill? Can you pick up milk? I'm working late again. The warmth we used to generate just by being in the same room started requiring effort, and then the effort started feeling like work neither of us wanted to do. I told myself it was normal. People in their 30s get busy. Careers demand attention. Romance ebbs and flows like tides, and if you wait long enough, the water comes back. I was waiting for a tide that had already turned. I started noticing details I'd trained myself to overlook. A new perfume I didn't recognize. Receipts from restaurants I'd never been to. The way she'd smile at her phone and then put it down too quickly when I entered the room. Her laugh changed texture, less open, more guarded, like she was editing herself in real time. We still shared a bed, but the space between us grew measurable. 12 inches became 18, became a canyon you could fall through without making a sound. I tried initiating conversations about us, but they died in the air like smoke. She'd say she was tired or stressed or just needed space, and I'd back off because pushing felt like proof I didn't understand her anymore. Men in their late 30s know this territory. You've been with someone long enough to map their moods, and when the map stops matching the terrain, you notice. But noticing and acting are different things. I noticed and did nothing because doing something meant admitting the foundation had cracks, and I'd spent 13 years believing we'd built something earthquake-proof. I kept my head down, worked longer hours, and told myself that if I just stayed steady, she'd come back to center. Stability was my offering. It used to be enough. The unraveling began with a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I came home early from a site inspection, boots still muddy, and found Claire in the bedroom with the door half closed. Her voice carried a softness I hadn't heard in months, the kind of tone that curls around words meant for one person. I stood in the hallway, groceries still in hand, and listened to her laugh the way she used to laugh with me. She said things like I miss you too and tonight can't come fast enough and don't worry, he won't know. The groceries hit the floor before I decided to drop them. She heard the sound, and the call ended mid-sentence. When she opened the door, her face showed the math of someone calculating how much I'd heard. I asked the question men ask when they already know the answer. Who was that? She said a client. I asked which one. She said it didn't matter. I asked why a client conversation sounded like a confession, and she told me I was being paranoid. Paranoia is when the fear isn't founded. This was founded. I could feel the ground shifting under every word she wasn't saying. We stood in that hallway, her blocking the bedroom, me holding a bag of split oranges, and the silence between us said more than any argument could. She walked past me without another word, grabbed her keys, and left. I heard her car start, heard the engine fade, and then I stood alone in a house that suddenly felt like evidence. I didn't chase her. Men my age understand that chasing someone who's already gone just leaves you winded and more alone. I walked into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed we'd picked out together 7 years ago. The sage green wall looked dull in the fading light. I noticed things I'd stopped seeing. Her side of the closet more empty than full. Drawers that used to overflow now neat and minimal, like she'd been editing her presence here one item at a time. I opened her nightstand and found it nearly bare. No lotion, no bookmarks, no receipts or hair ties or the small human debris that accumulates when someone actually lives somewhere. It looked like a hotel room staged to suggest occupancy without commitment. I pulled out my phone and opened our shared bank account, the one we'd used for bills and groceries and the mortgage that kept this house upright. The balance looked wrong. I scrolled through recent transactions and saw withdrawals I didn't recognize. 400 here, 600 there, 1,000 last week to an account I'd never seen. The pattern was methodical, almost polite, like someone siphoning gas slowly enough that you don't notice the tank emptying until you're coasting on fumes. I checked the savings account next. It had been healthy 3 months ago, enough for emergencies and the kitchen remodel we'd been planning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Now it was a number that barely covered a bad weekend. My hands didn't shake. They went still, the way they do when your body knows something your mind hasn't finished processing yet. I called the bank the next morning from my truck parked outside a job site I couldn't focus on. The representative was pleasant and efficient, walking me through the transfers with the detachment of someone reading a grocery list. All transactions were authorized by the account holder, she said. I asked which holder. She said both names were on the account, so either could move funds. I asked if there was a way to see where the money went. She gave me routing numbers that traced to an account I didn't have access to. I thanked her and hung up, then sat watching construction workers frame a building that would stand longer than my marriage. I didn't confront Claire that night or the next. Confrontation without information is just noise, and I needed to understand the shape of what I was dealing with before I said anything that couldn't be unsaid. I started keeping notes, a habit from work where details matter and memory fails. I logged her late nights, her unexplained absences, the times she said she was at the gym but came home without the flush or the smell of effort. I checked the mileage on her car against the distances she claimed to drive. Numbers don't lie, and the numbers were telling a story about drives that went farther than she admitted and stops that lasted longer than errands should. I hired a private investigator not because I wanted to, but because I needed proof that would hold up when everything else fell apart. His name was Tom Brewster, a former cop who now worked divorce cases and insurance fraud. He had the kind of face that blended into crowds, and a voice that didn't waste words. I gave him Claire's schedule, her car description, the name Ethan, and a retainer check that hurt to write. He didn't promise miracles. He promised documentation. That was enough. 3 days later, Tom called with an address. A condo in the Pearl District, upscale and new, the kind of place Claire and I used to walk past and joke about affording someday. He sent photos. Claire entering the building at 8 in the evening, leaving at midnight. A man meeting her at the door, tall and lean, with the confident posture of someone who'd never had to rebuild a foundation or tile a bathroom. They kissed on the threshold, not the polite peck of friends, but the kiss of people who'd been waiting all day to stop pretending. Tom sent video next. The two of them on a balcony, wine glasses catching the city lights, her laughing with her whole body in a way I hadn't seen in a year. I watched the footage 3 times, not because I didn't believe it, but because belief required repetition. Each viewing etched details deeper. The way she touched his arm. The way he leaned into her space like he belonged there. The ease between them that spoke of routine, of time invested, of a relationship that had roots. This wasn't new. This was established. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark living room of a house that no longer felt like mine, and let the weight of it settle. Betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a door closing softly on a life you thought was yours. Tom's final report came a week later, thorough and brutal. Claire had been seeing Ethan Morrison for at least 8 months, maybe longer. He was a creative director at the agency where she freelanced, divorced, no kids, the kind of man who wore expensive casual clothes and drove a car that said success without shouting. They'd been careful, rotating between his condo, hotels, and afternoon meetings that weren't about work. The money she'd moved from our accounts had funded a lifestyle I wasn't part of. Dinners at restaurants we couldn't afford. Weekend trips I thought were work conferences. A second life built on the back of ours, funded by the stability I provided while offering none of it in return. I didn't rage. Rage is what happens when you're surprised. I was past surprise. I felt something colder and more permanent, the kind of clarity that comes when all the small lies finally align into one large truth. I made a list, the same way I'd make a project plan at work. Steps that needed to happen in order, each one building on the last. Secure my finances. Consult a lawyer. Document everything. Protect what I built before someone else could strip it for parts. I wasn't interested in revenge. Revenge is messy and expensive and ultimately hollow. I was interested in survival, in walking away from this wreckage with enough left to build something new. I opened a separate bank account at a different institution and rerouted my paycheck. I moved half of what was left in savings into that account, legal and justified given the circumstances. I pulled copies of every financial document we had, every deed, every title, every statement that proved what was mine versus what was ours. I stored them in a fireproof box at my brother's place, insurance against the chaos I knew was coming. I consulted an attorney named Linda Voss who specialized in divorce and asset protection. She listened to my story without interruption, took notes in a leather folio, and gave me the advice I needed. File first, she said. Control the narrative. Don't wait for her to set the terms. The divorce papers were drafted quickly, cleanly, citing irreconcilable differences because Oregon is a no-fault state and proving adultery doesn't change the math. Linda included a request for full financial disclosure and an accounting of the funds Claire had moved. We filed on a Tuesday morning, and the process server delivered the papers to Claire at her studio that afternoon. I wasn't there to see her face, but I imagine it looked like someone who'd been running and suddenly hit a wall. Her first call came 20 minutes later. 12 missed calls followed. I didn't answer. I'd said everything I needed to say in legal language on paper that couldn't argue back. She came home that evening, papers in hand, face pale and voice high. We need to talk, she said, and I agreed. We sat at the kitchen table where we'd eaten 1,000 meals and planned a future that no longer existed. She tried to explain, to justify, to rewrite history in a way that made her the victim of circumstance rather than the architect of betrayal. She said things like we grew apart and you were always working and I needed something you couldn't give. I listened without interrupting because interrupting would mean I cared about the excuses. When she finished, I asked one question. How long? She hesitated, then said 8 months. Tom's report said longer, but I didn't correct her. Lies have a way of compounding, and I didn't need her honesty anymore. I needed her gone. She asked if we could try counseling, if we could work through this, if 13 years meant anything. I said it used to mean everything, and that was the problem. You don't rebuild a house when the foundation is gone. You clear the lot and start over. She cried, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not sympathy, just the emptiness that comes when someone's tears no longer reach you. I told her she had 30 days to move out per the lease separation terms Linda had drafted. She asked where she'd go. I suggested Ethan's place. She left the table without another word, and I sat there until the room went dark, listening to the house settle in the silence that marriages leave behind. The next 3 weeks were mechanical. Claire moved her things in stages, each trip removing more evidence of the life we'd shared. I stayed at my brother's to avoid the overlap, to spare myself the sight of her erasing us box by box. Friends called, awkward and careful, asking if I was okay. I said I was fine because fine is what you say when the truth is too complicated to explain. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects, staying late at the office, drafting plans for water systems that would outlast any relationship I'd ever have. Colleagues noticed but didn't pry. Men in their 30s learn to give each other space when the personal bleeds into the professional. I was 3 weeks into this new, unmoored existence when Claire Chen rang my brother's doorbell at 7 a.m. on a Saturday. I opened the door in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, coffee mug in hand, expecting a package or a neighbor. Instead, I found my soon-to-be former mother-in-law standing on the porch with red, swollen eyes, and an envelope clutched in both hands like a life raft. She looked older than I remembered, as if the last month had aged her in dog years. Her voice cracked when she spoke, and the first words out of her mouth weren't hello or how are you. They were I'm sorry. I stood there, frozen, because I didn't have a script for this. Margaret had always been kind to me, present at birthdays and holidays, supportive in the quiet way that good in-laws are. We'd shared meals and conversations, and I'd always felt welcomed into her family without reservation. Seeing her now, diminished and desperate, broke something I didn't know was still intact. I stepped aside and let her in, and she walked past me into the small living room like she was entering a confessional. She sat on the edge of the couch, back straight, hands folded around the envelope, and took a breath that sounded like it came from her shoes. She said she needed to tell me things she should have told me years ago, things that might help me understand what happened and why. I wanted to say I didn't need to understand, that understanding wouldn't undo the damage, but something in her face stopped me. This wasn't about making excuses for Claire. This was about unburdening herself of a weight she'd carried too long. I sat across from her in a chair that didn't match the couch and nodded for her to continue. She looked at me with the kind of sadness that only parents can carry, the sadness of watching your child destroy something good and knowing you saw it coming. Margaret opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of papers, old and creased, some with dates going back over a decade. She spread them on the coffee table between us like evidence at a trial. There were receipts, letters, printed emails, photographs that captured moments I wasn't part of. She said the first sentence slowly, as if testing the weight of each word. Claire has done this before. Not once, but 3 times that I know of. She looked at me to gauge my reaction, but I stayed still, giving her space to continue. Margaret's voice steadied as she moved deeper into confession, the way people do once they've committed to the fall. She told me about Claire's first serious relationship in college, a boy named Aaron who'd been steady and kind and planning a future with her. Claire had cheated on him during spring break, a fling with someone she met at a party, and when Aaron found out, he left without drama or demands. Margaret said Claire cried for a week, swore it was a mistake, promised it would never happen again. But it did. 2 years later with a man named Kyle who'd put a down payment on a ring and started looking at houses. Claire met someone at a work event, started an affair that lasted 4 months, and when Kyle discovered text messages, he walked away. Quietly. Margaret said she'd confronted Claire both times, asked her why she kept sabotaging good men, and Claire always said the same thing. She didn't know. She didn't mean to. She'd do better. But she never did. The 3rd time was with a man named Jason, someone Claire dated for 2 years before we met. Margaret described him as patient and devoted, someone who'd supported Claire through a rough job transition and helped her move twice without complaint. Claire cheated on him too, this time with a coworker who promised nothing and delivered less. Jason found out when a mutual friend showed him photos from a party Claire said she hadn't attended. He ended it over the phone, told Margaret later that he didn't have the energy to hear her explanations. Margaret said she begged Claire to get help, to see a counselor, to figure out why she kept destroying relationships with men who loved her. Claire refused, said she didn't need therapy, that she just hadn't found the right person yet. Margaret looked at me then, eyes wet, and said that when Claire brought me home, she thought I was the answer. She said I was different from the others, more grounded, more steady, the kind of man who wouldn't give up easily. She prayed that my stability would be enough to keep Claire anchored, that this time would be different because I was different. She said she knew it was wrong to hope I'd fix her daughter, but hope doesn't ask permission. It just arrives and makes you believe things you shouldn't. She said she watched us build a life together and felt relief every year we stayed intact, believing she'd been wrong about Claire, that maybe her daughter had finally grown past the pattern. But patterns don't break just because you stop looking at them. Margaret handed me the papers, told me to read them when I was ready. There were emails between her and Claire from years ago, messages where Claire admitted to affairs and begged her mother not to tell anyone. There were receipts from hotels and restaurants that mapped out timelines of betrayal. There were letters from the men Claire had hurt, messages to Margaret asking what they'd done wrong, whether there were signs they'd missed. I looked at the pile and felt the weight of it, not just the paper but the years of silence that had protected a lie I'd been living inside. Margaret said she was telling me now because I deserved to know I hadn't failed. Claire's pattern was set long before I arrived, and nothing I could have done would have changed it. She cried then, full and unguarded, and apologized again. She said she should have warned me before the wedding, should have pulled me aside and given me the chance to choose with full knowledge. But she'd been selfish, wanting to believe this time would be different, wanting to see her daughter happy and settled. She said her silence made her complicit, and she'd been carrying that guilt like a stone since the divorce papers were filed. I didn't know what to say. Anger felt useless, and forgiveness felt premature. I settled on thank you, because the truth, even late, is still a gift. It doesn't repair the damage, but it names it, and naming things gives you power over them. Margaret stood to leave, moving slowly like someone who'd set down a heavy load and wasn't sure how to walk without it. She turned at the door and said one last thing. She said Claire called her yesterday, crying, saying she'd made a mistake and wanted to fix things with me. Margaret told her it was too late, that some mistakes don't get fixed, they just get learned from. She said she hoped I'd find someone who understood what I was worth, someone who wouldn't need to lose me to realize what she had. She hugged me briefly, the kind of hug that says goodbye to more than just a person, and then she walked to her car and drove away. I stood in the doorway long after her taillights disappeared, holding an envelope full of someone else's failures. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of Portland day that makes you believe winter might eventually end. I went back inside, sat at the small kitchen table in my brother's rental, and spread the papers out. I read every email, every receipt, every apology that Claire had made to men whose names I now knew. The pattern was undeniable. She pursued relationships with good men, built trust, then sabotaged it with affairs that offered nothing but momentary excitement. Each time, she expressed regret. Each time, she promised change. Each time, she repeated the cycle. I thought about the 13 years I'd given her, the house I'd renovated, the future I'd designed around us. I thought about the nights I'd lain awake wondering what I'd done wrong, what I'd failed to provide, how I'd let her slip away. Margaret's confession answered those questions with a clarity that hurt and healed at the same time. I hadn't failed. I'd been set up to fail from the beginning, handed a role in a play where the ending was written before I auditioned. That knowledge didn't erase the pain, but it shifted it. The weight moved from my shoulders to hers, where it belonged. I called Linda Voss that afternoon and told her about Margaret's visit. She listened carefully, asked if I had copies of the documents, and told me they could be useful if Claire contested the divorce terms. Patterns of behavior establish character, she said, and character matters in court. I asked if I wanted to use them, if dragging Claire's past into legal proceedings would make me feel better or just make everything messier. Linda said it was my choice, that I could file them as evidence or keep them as personal confirmation. I decided to keep them private. I didn't need a judge to validate what I now knew. I just needed to move forward with the confidence that I'd done nothing wrong. The divorce proceeded without additional drama. Claire signed the papers, agreed to the terms, and moved out of the house on schedule. I bought out her half of the equity using funds from the separate account I'd established, and the title transferred to my name alone. The house was mine again, though it felt different now, less like a home and more like a shell of one. I considered selling it, starting fresh somewhere new, but that felt like letting her take more than she already had. Instead, I repainted the bedroom, tore out the sage green wall, and replaced it with a neutral gray that didn't hold memories. I rearranged furniture, donated things we'd bought together, and slowly made the space mine. Work became my anchor. I took on a major project designing a water reclamation system for a growing suburb east of Portland, something complex enough to demand my full attention. I spent long days at the site, consulting with engineers and contractors, solving problems that had clear solutions and measurable outcomes. It felt good to build something that would last, something that served a purpose beyond my own broken narrative. Colleagues noticed I was more focused, more present, and a few commented that I seemed lighter. I didn't tell them about the divorce or Margaret's confession. I just let the work speak for itself. Months passed, and the sharp edges of betrayal dulled into something manageable. I started running again, early morning routes through Laurelhurst Park that cleared my head and reminded me my body still worked even when my heart felt sluggish. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the marriage, guys from college and old coworkers who didn't ask too many questions and didn't offer too much advice. We'd meet for beers, watch Trailblazers games, talk about nothing important and everything that mattered. Slowly, I remembered who I was before Claire, before the house, before the life I'd built around someone else's center. I thought about dating but didn't pursue it. The idea of trusting someone new felt exhausting, like learning a language I'd failed at before. I wasn't bitter, just cautious, aware that my picker might be broken and needed recalibration. I focused instead on small pleasures. Cooking meals I actually wanted to eat. Reading books I'd been meaning to get to. Fixing things around the house not because they were broken, but because the act of repair felt like progress. I adopted a dog from the shelter, a lab mix named Copper who needed as much of a fresh start as I did. He filled the house with noise and purpose, and his simple needs reminded me that love doesn't have to be complicated to be real. A year after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Claire at a coffee shop in Hawthorne. It was accidental, the kind of overlap that happens in a city that's big but not big enough. She was with Ethan, both of them looking comfortable and coupled, and for a moment I felt the old wound pulse. But it passed quickly, replaced by something closer to indifference. She saw me, hesitated, then offered a small wave. I nodded back, ordered my coffee, and left without lingering. There was nothing to say. We'd both moved on, though the destinations looked different. Later that week, Margaret called. It was the first time we'd spoken since that morning on my brother's porch. She asked how I was, and I told her the truth. I was good, better than expected, building a life that fit me instead of trying to fit someone else's design. She said she was glad, that she thought about me often, that she hoped I'd found some peace. I told her I had, and that her honesty, though painful, had been part of that. She thanked me for saying so, and we ended the call with the kind of closure that doesn't need a reunion to feel complete. I kept the envelope Margaret gave me in a drawer I rarely opened, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't need to look at it anymore. The truth it contained had done its work. It had freed me from the guilt of thinking I'd caused the collapse, and it had given me permission to stop wondering what I could have done differently. Some people carry patterns that no amount of love or effort can break. Claire was one of those people. Recognizing that wasn't cruel, it was clarity. And clarity, I learned, is the foundation you build on when you're ready to try again. 2 years after the divorce, I met someone new. Her name was Rachel, a landscape architect with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes and a no-nonsense approach to life that I appreciated. We met at a professional conference, bonded over complaints about poorly designed drainage systems, and exchanged numbers without pretense. Our first date was coffee, our second was a hike, and by the third I knew I wanted to see where this could go. She knew about my divorce, not the details but the shape of it, and she didn't treat me like I was damaged. She treated me like I was human, which was all I needed. We took things slow, both of us aware that rushing leads to repeating. She met Copper, and he approved. I met her friends, and they were kind. We talked about our pasts without letting them dictate our future, and we built something that felt sturdy because it was honest. I didn't compare her to Claire because comparison is a trap that keeps you tethered to what's gone. Rachel was her own person, with her own strengths and flaws, and I loved her for who she was, not for who she wasn't. Margaret sent a card when she heard I was seeing someone, a simple note that said she was happy for me and hoped this relationship brought me joy. I appreciated the gesture, the acknowledgement that we'd both survived something difficult and come out the other side. I never heard from Claire again, and I didn't seek her out. Some chapters close completely, and that's okay. You don't need an epilogue when the story has already said everything it needed to say. If you're reading this from the other side of betrayal, from a place where trust feels impossible and the future looks blurry, hear me. You will survive this. Not because you're strong, though you are. Not because time heals, though it helps. You'll survive because you'll choose to, one small decision at a time. You'll choose honesty over denial. You'll choose boundaries over bitterness. You'll choose to build again, even when the tools feel heavy and the blueprint looks uncertain. And one day, you'll wake up and realize the weight has lifted, not because the past changed, but because you did. Start with the truth. Seek it, sit with it, let it inform your next steps. Protect what's yours, not out of spite but out of respect for the life you've built. Surround yourself with people who see you clearly and love you anyway. And when you're ready, let someone new in. Not to fix you, because you're not broken. But to share the life you've rebuilt, the one that's stronger because it's honest. That's how you move forward. Not by forgetting, but by remembering what you're worth and refusing to settle for less. If this story reached you where you needed it, drop one word below so I know you're here. Rebuilt. The envelope Margaret left sat in my desk drawer for 3 days before I could bring myself to read everything thoroughly. Each document felt like a small detonation, the kind that doesn't destroy buildings but shifts everything inside them. I spread the papers across my brother's kitchen table late one evening when he was out, giving myself permission to feel whatever came without an audience. The first email was dated 7 years before Claire and I met, a message from her to Margaret admitting she'd been unfaithful to Aaron and didn't know how to tell him. The language was young and frantic, full of excuses about being confused and making a terrible mistake. Margaret's response was measured and firm, telling Claire she needed to be honest with Aaron and face the consequences of her choices. The next document was a printed text conversation between Claire and Kyle, the man she'd cheated on after Aaron. The messages showed Kyle confronting her with evidence, screenshots of flirty exchanges with another man, plans to meet at hotels, promises that clearly violated their relationship. Claire's responses cycled through denial, deflection, and finally minimal admission. She said it wasn't serious, that it didn't mean anything, that she still loved Kyle and wanted to make it work. His final message was short and devastating. "You don't hurt people you love like this. I'm done." There was no reply from Claire after that, just a gap in the conversation where a relationship used to be. Further into the stack, I found a handwritten letter from Jason addressed to Margaret, not Claire. His handwriting was neat and controlled, the kind you use when you're trying to keep emotion from bleeding through the ink. He thanked Margaret for always being kind to him, said he wished things had worked out differently with Claire, and asked her to please encourage her daughter to seek help. He wrote that he didn't think Claire was a bad person, just someone who kept making choices that hurt good people, and that pattern would continue until she decided to break it. He ended the letter by saying he hoped Claire would find happiness, but he couldn't be collateral damage in her search for it. The date on the letter was 4 months before Claire and I started dating. I read that letter 3 times, feeling a strange kinship with a man I'd never met. Jason's words could have been mine. The frustration, the confusion, the reluctant acceptance that some people aren't capable of the commitment they promise. Margaret had kept this letter for over a decade, a warning sign she'd filed away instead of posting where I might have seen it. I understood why. Hope is a powerful anesthetic. It numbs you to red flags and convinces you that this time will be different because you want it to be. Margaret had hoped I'd be the exception to Claire's pattern, and I'd hoped my love would be enough to keep her faithful. We'd both been wrong, but at least now I knew the truth wasn't personal. It was procedural. The financial records Margaret included showed a pattern I recognized immediately. In each relationship, Claire had started moving money once the affair began, small amounts at first, then larger withdrawals as the deception deepened. With Kyle, she'd opened a credit card he didn't know about and racked up charges at restaurants and hotels. With Jason, she'd taken cash advances from their joint account to fund weekend trips she claimed were work-related. The amounts weren't massive, but the pattern was clear. Deception costs money, and Claire financed her double life by quietly siphoning resources from the men who trusted her. I thought about our empty savings account and felt less like a victim and more like the latest iteration of a well-practiced scheme. One document stood out from the rest, a printed email exchange between Margaret and a therapist Claire had seen briefly after the situation with Jason. The therapist couldn't share details due to confidentiality, but she'd reached out to Margaret at Claire's request to provide general guidance. The therapist wrote that Claire exhibited patterns consistent with someone seeking external validation to fill internal voids, that her affairs weren't about the other men but about a need for novelty and attention that steady relationships couldn't satisfy. She recommended ongoing therapy and possibly medication to address underlying anxiety, but noted that Claire had stopped attending sessions after only 3 meetings. Margaret's reply asked if there was anything she could do as a parent. The therapist's response was compassionate but clear. "Your daughter has to want to change. You can't want it for her." I closed the email printout and sat back, feeling the full weight of what Margaret had given me. This wasn't just an explanation. It was a roadmap of inevitability. Claire had been offered help, insight, and multiple chances to break her pattern, and she'd declined them all. Each relationship had been a reset button she pressed, hoping proximity to a good man would fix whatever was broken inside her. But proximity doesn't heal. It just provides temporary distance from the problem until the problem resurfaces. I'd been her fourth attempt at a geographic cure, and like the three before me, I'd eventually become the thing she needed distance from. I thought about the early years of our marriage, the times Claire had seemed genuinely happy and present. I'd believed those moments were the real her, and the distance that came later was just life getting in the way. Now I understood that the early years were the easy part, the phase where novelty and optimism could mask the patterns underneath. Once routine set in, once the relationship required sustained effort instead of initial excitement, Claire's need for external validation kicked in. She'd gone looking for the feeling she had at the beginning, not realizing that feeling isn't sustainable. It's a spark, not a fire. You have to build the fire yourself, and Claire had never learned how. I gathered the documents and returned them to the envelope, then placed it back in the drawer. I didn't need to keep rereading them. The information had done its work. It had answered the questions that had been eating at me for months. Why hadn't I been enough? The answer was that enough was never the issue. Claire's problem wasn't a deficit in what I provided. It was a deficit in what she could receive. No amount of stability, affection, or commitment would have filled the hole she was trying to fill with affairs, because that hole wasn't relationship-shaped. It was self-shaped. Only she could fill it, and she'd chosen not to try. The next morning, I called Linda Voss and told her I'd received additional information about Claire's history but had decided not to use it in the divorce proceedings. Linda asked if I was sure, reminding me that evidence of pattern behavior could strengthen my position if Claire decided to contest any terms. I told her I was certain. The divorce was already settled, and dragging Claire's past into a courtroom wouldn't change the outcome. It would just create more pain for everyone involved, including Margaret, who'd taken a risk by being honest with me. Linda respected my decision and made a note in my file. Sometimes winning isn't about leverage. It's about knowing when you've already got what you need. Work continued to be my refuge during this period. The water reclamation project I'd taken on was moving into its critical phase, requiring daily site visits and constant coordination between multiple teams. I found comfort in the complexity, in problems that had solutions you could engineer and test. One afternoon, I was reviewing pipe layouts with a contractor when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I ignored it initially, but it buzzed again a few minutes later, then a third time. During a break, I checked the messages. They were from Claire. She'd gotten a new number, probably because I'd blocked her old one. The texts were long and rambling, a stream of consciousness that veered between apology and justification. She said she missed me, that she'd made terrible mistakes, that Ethan wasn't who she thought he was and things weren't working out. She said she'd been thinking about our marriage and realized how good we'd had. How much she'd taken for granted. She asked if we could meet for coffee, just to talk, no expectations. She said she wasn't asking me to take her back, just to hear her out. The messages came in rapid succession, each one more desperate than the last, and I could almost hear the panic in her typed words. I didn't respond. Men in their late 30s learn that some invitations are traps disguised as olive branches. Claire wasn't reaching out because she missed me. She was reaching out because her new situation wasn't delivering what she'd expected, and the grass she'd thought was greener had turned out to be spray-painted. I'd seen this movie before, in Margaret's documents, in the texts between Claire and Kyle where she'd tried to walk back her betrayal once it cost her something. The pattern was predictable. Sabotage the relationship, pursue the affair, realize the affair is empty, try to return to the stability she destroyed. I wasn't interested in being the safety net she jumped to when her circus act failed. I blocked the new number and went back to work. The contractor asked if everything was okay. I said it was fine, just personal stuff that didn't matter anymore. He nodded and we returned to discussing flow rates and valve placements, concrete problems with concrete solutions. That evening, I told my brother about the texts. He listened without interrupting, then asked what I wanted to do. I said I wanted to do nothing, which was exactly what I did. Silence is a complete sentence, and sometimes it's the most articulate response you can give. Claire tried reaching out through other channels over the next few weeks. She sent an email to my work address that I deleted without reading. She left a voicemail on my office phone that I erased without listening to. She even contacted one of our mutual friends and asked him to pass along a message that she wanted to apologize in person. The friend, a guy named Marcus who'd known both of us for years, called me to relay the request. I told him I appreciated him reaching out, but I wasn't interested in reopening communication with Claire. Marcus understood. He'd been through his own divorce and knew that some doors stay closed for good reason. Marcus did tell me one thing that confirmed what I'd suspected. He said Claire and Ethan had split up, that the relationship had burned out fast once it transitioned from secret affair to actual partnership. Apparently, Ethan had expected Claire to contribute equally to rent and expenses at his condo, and Claire had been surprised by his lack of romantic gestures now that they were official. Marcus said he'd run into her at a mutual friend's party and she'd seemed lost, asking about me, wondering how I was doing. He'd kept his answers vague and changed the subject. I thanked him for respecting my boundaries and for giving me the update. It helped to know my instinct about her motivations had been accurate. Spring arrived in Portland with the kind of optimism the city specializes in, rain giving way to cherry blossoms and longer days that made you believe in renewal. I started spending more time outdoors, taking Copper on extended hikes through the gorge, exploring trails I'd never prioritized when I was married. The physical exertion felt cleansing, like I was sweating out the residue of the past year. I'd reach a viewpoint, sit on a rock with my dog panting beside me, and feel something close to contentment. Not happiness yet, but the foundation it could be built on. I also started attending a men's group that met every other Thursday at a community center in southeast Portland. It wasn't therapy exactly, more like a structured space where men could talk about life transitions without judgment. The group included divorcees, widowers, guys navigating career changes, fathers struggling with custody arrangements. Ages ranged from early 30s to late 60s, and the common thread was that everyone was trying to figure out how to move forward after something significant had ended. I didn't talk much in the first few sessions, content to listen and learn from others' experiences. But eventually, I shared my story, not all of it, just the outline. Married 13 years, wife had an affair, discovered a pattern of infidelity in her past, chose to divorce and rebuild. The responses were validating in a way I hadn't expected. Other men nodded in recognition, shared similar stories of betrayal and the slow work of recovery. One guy, a mechanic named Ron who was about 50, said something that stuck with me. He said the hardest part of his divorce wasn't losing his wife, it was losing his belief that he could trust his own judgment. He'd missed signs, ignored red flags, and spent years wondering if he was fundamentally broken at reading people. But over time, he realized that trust isn't about being right every time. It's about being willing to risk being wrong because the alternative is living in a bunker. His words gave me permission to stop beating myself up for not seeing Claire's pattern sooner. I'd trusted because that's what you do in a marriage. The failure wasn't mine for trusting. It was hers for exploiting it. The group became a regular part of my routine, a place where I could process emotions I didn't want to burden my friends or family with. Between the group, work, time with Copper, and the occasional dinner with my brother or old friends, I was building a life that felt sustainable. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine, and that mattered. I started thinking about what I wanted next, not in terms of relationships but in terms of personal goals. I'd always wanted to get my professional engineering license, a credential that required additional exams and experience documentation. I started studying in the evenings, working through practice problems and reviewing materials I hadn't touched since graduate school. The studying gave me a sense of forward momentum, proof that I was investing in a future that didn't depend on anyone else's choices. I scheduled my exam for late summer, giving myself several months to prepare. The discipline required felt good, like I was training for something that mattered. Friends noticed the shift in my energy. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was planning. There's a difference between getting through days and building towards something, and I'd crossed that threshold without realizing exactly when it happened. Margaret reached out again in early summer, a brief email asking if she could take me to lunch. She said she didn't want to intrude, but she'd been thinking about me and wanted to check in. I agreed, curious about what she wanted to say and appreciating that she'd asked rather than assuming I'd be available. We met at a small Vietnamese restaurant in the Jade District, the kind of place with plastic chairs and food that tastes like someone's grandmother made it. Margaret looked healthier than she had that morning on my brother's porch, less burdened, though I could see the weight she still carried in her eyes. We ordered pho and made small talk about the weather in her garden, easing into the real conversation slowly. Finally, she asked how I was doing, really doing, and I told her the truth. I was okay, better than I'd expected to be, building a life that felt right even if it looked different than what I'd planned. She smiled, a sad, proud smile, and said she was glad. Then she told me why she'd wanted to meet. Claire had reached out to her recently, asking for money. Margaret had declined, and Claire had gotten angry, accusing her mother of choosing me over her own daughter. Margaret said it wasn't about choosing sides. It was about refusing to enable behavior that kept hurting people. She said Claire was struggling financially, that Ethan had ended their relationship and she was living with a friend, working freelance jobs that barely covered rent. Margaret had offered to help Claire find a therapist, to support her if she committed to real change, but Claire had refused. She wanted money, not advice. She wanted rescue, not responsibility. Margaret said no, and they hadn't spoken since. I could see the pain that decision had cost her, the way it carved lines deeper around her mouth. Saying no to your child, even an adult child making destructive choices, goes against every parental instinct. But Margaret had done it anyway, and I respected her for it. I asked Margaret how she was holding up. She said some days were harder than others, that she'd grieved the daughter she'd hoped Claire would become and struggled with guilt over whether she'd failed as a parent. I told her what the men's group had taught me, that you can't own someone else's choices, even when you love them. Claire had been given opportunities, resources, and examples of healthier paths. She'd chosen not to take them. That wasn't Margaret's failure. It was Claire's. Margaret's eyes filled, and she reached across the table to squeeze my hand. She thanked me for saying that, for not blaming her, for being kind when she'd worried I might be angry that she hadn't warned me sooner. I told her I understood why she'd stayed silent, that hope makes us all a little reckless with the truth. What mattered was that she'd eventually told me, and that honesty had freed me from wondering what I'd done wrong. We finished our meal talking about lighter things, her plans to visit her sister in California, my exam preparation, the ridiculous things Copper did that made me laugh. When we parted in the parking lot, she hugged me longer than necessary, and I realized this might be the last time we'd see each other. Our connection had been through Claire, and with that severed, there wasn't much holding us together. But I was grateful for her, for the risk she'd taken to give me truth when lies would have been easier. Summer in Portland is a gift you don't refuse. Long days, outdoor concerts, food cart pods that turn parking lots into community spaces. I started saying yes to invitations I might have declined before, joining coworkers for after-work brewery visits, meeting old college friends for weekend hikes, attending a cousin's barbecue where I played with kids and felt the simple pleasure of family without complication. I wasn't actively looking for a relationship, but I was opening myself to connection, and that felt like progress. It was at a professional conference in late July that I met Rachel. The conference was focused on sustainable water infrastructure, and I'd signed up mostly for the continuing education credits I needed. Rachel was presenting on integrating green infrastructure into urban landscapes, and her talk was engaging and practical, full of case studies and data that showed how cities could manage stormwater while creating community assets. After her presentation, I approached her with a question about soil permeability rates, and we ended up talking through the coffee break about overlapping challenges in our fields. She was sharp and funny, with a directness I appreciated. When I mentioned I worked in civil engineering, she joked that we were natural enemies, planners always wanting bigger pipes while landscape architects fought for smaller footprints and more green space. I laughed and said maybe we could find middle ground over coffee sometime. She said maybe we could, and we exchanged business cards like professionals who were pretending this was entirely about work. I emailed her the next day, suggesting a coffee shop halfway between our offices, and she agreed. Our first meeting was easy in a way that surprised me. We talked about work and projects, but also about our lives outside of professional identities. She'd been married briefly in her late 20s, an amicable split with no kids and no drama, just two people who realized they wanted different things before it was too late to course correct. She asked about my situation, and I gave her the abbreviated version. Married for 13 years, divorced recently, working on rebuilding. She didn't press for details, didn't treat me like I was damaged, just nodded and said transitions are hard but they also create space for new things. I appreciated that she didn't pathologize my past or rush to reassure me that everything happens for a reason. She just let it be what it was. We met for coffee again the following week, then for dinner, then for a hike that turned into a 6-hour conversation covering everything from terrible movies we love to opinions on the Oxford comma. Rachel was easy to be around, present and curious without being invasive. She had her own life, her own friends, her own projects that excited her. She wasn't looking for someone to complete her, just someone to share time with while they both kept building their individual lives. That balance felt right. I'd learned from Claire that relationships built on need tend to collapse under their own weight. Relationships built on choice, on two people who want each other but don't require each other for basic functioning, those have a better chance of lasting. I didn't tell Rachel about Claire's pattern or Margaret's confession for a while. It felt like information that was mine to carry, not something I needed to unload on someone I was just getting to know. But a few months into dating, during a quiet evening at her apartment, she asked about my marriage and what had ended it. I told her the full story, not sparing details but not dramatizing them either. I told her about the affair, the discovery of Claire's history, Margaret's visit, the documents that proved I'd been the fourth iteration of a pattern I hadn't known existed. Rachel listened without interrupting, her face serious and attentive. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said it sounded like I'd done everything right, that I'd handled a terrible situation with integrity and clarity, and that she was sorry I'd gone through it but impressed by how I'd come out the other side. She said a lot of people would have become bitter or closed off, but I seemed open and willing to trust again, and that took courage. Her words landed softly, without fanfare, but they settled something in me. I realized I'd been waiting for someone to tell me I hadn't failed, and Rachel had just given me that permission without knowing I needed it. We continued dating through the fall, taking things at a pace that felt natural rather than rushed. She met Copper and declared him a good judge of character when he immediately warmed to her. I met her friends at a dinner party where I was nervous and overdressed, but they were welcoming and funny and made me feel like I belonged. Rachel and I didn't talk about the future in concrete terms, no pressure about moving in together or planning years ahead. We just enjoyed the present, each date and conversation building a foundation that felt sturdy because it wasn't forced. I passed my professional engineering exam in September, a milestone that represented more than just a credential. It was proof that I could set a goal and achieve it even while my personal life was in upheaval. My firm celebrated with a small party, and Rachel came, charming my coworkers and asking smart questions about projects I was working on. Later, she told me she was proud of me, and I believed her. Not because she had to say it, but because her presence at the party proved she cared enough to show up for moments that mattered to me. Claire reached out one more time in late October, a final attempt that came through Marcus again. She'd asked him to tell me she was sorry, truly sorry, and that she hoped I was happy. Marcus said she seemed genuine, subdued in a way he hadn't seen before, like maybe she was finally facing what she'd done. He asked if I wanted him to pass along any message. I thought about it, really considered whether there was anything I wanted to say, and decided there wasn't. Forgiveness is personal and internal. Claire didn't need to hear it from me for it to be real. I told Marcus to tell her I wished her well, and that was the truth. I didn't wish her harm. I just wished her gone from my life, and she was. Winter brought the kind of rain that makes you appreciate having a solid roof and warm socks. Rachel and I spent evenings cooking together, trying recipes we found online and laughing when they didn't turn out as pictured. We watched movies, read books side by side on our couch, took Copper to the dog park on dry days and let him run himself exhausted. The relationship deepened naturally, without drama or grand gestures, just consistent presence and care. I started keeping a toothbrush at her place, and she started keeping running shoes at mine. Small integrations that signaled we were building something without needing to announce it. I thought about Margaret sometimes, wondered how she was doing, whether she and Claire had reconciled. I didn't reach out. Our story had reached its natural conclusion, and prolonging it would only create awkwardness neither of us needed. But I remained grateful for what she'd given me, the truth that had freed me from self-blame and allowed me to move forward with clarity. Some people enter your life briefly but leave permanent marks, and Margaret was one of them. As the year drew to a close, I took stock of where I was. Single and rebuilding a year ago, now in a relationship that felt healthy and sustainable. Living alone in a house that had been a museum of my failed marriage, now a space I'd made my own with new paint and furniture and the presence of a dog who loved me unconditionally. Working a job I'd been going through the motions at, now engaged with challenging projects and newly credentialed to take on more. The math added up to something I hadn't expected. Not just survival, but actual growth. Rachel and I spent New Year's Eve at a quiet party hosted by one of her friends, the kind of gathering where people actually talked instead of just drinking and counting down. At midnight, we kissed on a balcony overlooking the city, lights glittering below us, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope that Margaret had carried, the kind that ignores red flags and prays for different outcomes. But grounded hope, the kind built on evidence and experience, the knowledge that good things can happen when you're honest about the bad ones. Looking back, I could trace the arc from devastation to reconstruction. The morning Margaret appeared on that porch with her envelope of truth. The months of processing and grieving and slowly accepting that I hadn't been the problem. The decision to stay open instead of closing down, to risk trusting again instead of building walls. The small daily choices to show up for myself, to invest in my future, to believe I deserved better than what Claire had offered. None of it had been easy, but all of it had been necessary. If I could go back and talk to the version of me standing in that hallway, listening to Claire's voice curl around words meant for someone else, I'd tell him this. What you're about to lose isn't as valuable as what you're about to gain. You're going to lose a relationship built on lies and a future that was never real. But you're going to gain clarity, self-respect, and eventually a love that doesn't require you to ignore your instincts or compromise your worth. The path between those 2 points will hurt, but the destination is worth every step. Trust the process. Trust yourself. And when someone shows you the truth, even if it arrives late and wrapped in pain, receive it as the gift it is. I'd tell him that Margaret's confession wouldn't erase the betrayal, but it would reframe it. That knowing Claire's pattern wasn't personal but procedural would lift the weight of wondering what he could have done differently. That the answer was nothing, because the problem was never his to solve. I'd tell him that Copper would show up exactly when needed, that a men's group would provide community he didn't know he was missing, that a professional exam would give him purpose beyond his pain. And I'd tell him about Rachel, about how good love shows up quietly after bad love makes its loud exit, and how patience pays dividends that rushing never will. But I couldn't go back, and maybe that was okay. Maybe the point wasn't to spare myself the pain but to learn from it, to let it shape me without defining me. Claire had given me 13 years, some good, some terrible, all educational. Margaret had given me truth. Rachel was giving me a chance to try again with better information. And I was giving myself permission to believe that my best chapters were still ahead, written by a man who'd learned to read the signs and trust his own judgment. The house in Selwood still stood, mine alone now, filled with different furniture and better energy. Copper still chased squirrels in the backyard and still slept at the foot of my bed, a warm presence that asked for nothing but food and walks and occasional ear scratches. Work still challenged me, but now I tackled it with renewed focus and the confidence that comes from surviving something that was supposed to break you. And Rachel still showed up, consistent and Real, proving that patterns can be broken and new ones can be built from better materials. On a rainy Saturday in February, Rachel asked me about the future, not demanding answers but curious about my thinking. I told her I was happy where we were, that I wasn't in a rush but I was also not running away. That I could see a future with her, but I wanted us both to be sure, to build slowly and intentionally rather than leap in hope. She smiled and said that sounded right to her too, that she'd learned patience was a virtue, especially in relationships. We spent the rest of the afternoon planning a spring camping trip, marking trails on a map, and making lists of gear we'd need. Simple, ordinary, exactly what I'd been missing without knowing it. Margaret's envelope still sat in my desk drawer, rarely opened but never forgotten. It was a reminder of where I'd been and why I'd left, proof that truth matters even when it hurts. Some people might have burned those documents or thrown them away, erasing evidence of a painful chapter. But I kept them because they were part of my story, not the whole story but an important part. They represented the moment I stopped blaming myself and started understanding that some people carry patterns you can't love them out of. That lesson was worth preserving. Claire existed somewhere in Portland, living a life I knew nothing about and didn't need to know. I hoped she'd found help, that she'd broken her pattern and learned to build something that lasted. But her journey was hers to walk, and mine was mine. Our paths had diverged completely, and I felt nothing but relief about that divergence. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you once loved is let them go completely, no strings, no checking in, no maintaining connection for old time's sake. Clean breaks heal cleaner. I finished the year stronger than I'd started it, surrounded by people who saw me clearly and chose to stay, doing work that mattered and built things that would outlast me, loving a dog who thought I was perfect and a woman who knew I wasn't but liked me anyway. The math added up differently now, not to a failed marriage but to a life reconstructed on more honest foundations. I'd lost 13 years to Claire's pattern, but I'd gained clarity, boundaries, and the knowledge that I could survive the worst and still come out believing in the best. If you're reading this from a place of fresh betrayal, from the raw space where trust just shattered and the future looks impossible, I want you to know something. You will get through this. Not around it or over it, but through it, feeling every hard step until one day you realize you're on the other side. You'll learn things about yourself you didn't know you needed to learn. You'll discover strength you didn't know you had. You'll build a life that fits you better than the one you lost, even if you can't see that possibility right now. Start with the truth, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Surround yourself with people who tell you hard things because they care, not easy lies because they're comfortable. Protect what's yours, your dignity, your resources, your right to move forward without being dragged backward. And when you're ready, open yourself to the possibility that good things can still happen, that trust can be rebuilt, that love can show up in healthier forms. The timeline is yours to set. Don't rush it. But don't stop walking either. One word if this reached you where you needed it. Through. 3 years after Margaret knocked on that door, I stood in a different house with different light coming through different windows. Rachel and I had moved in together 6 months prior, not rushing but not stalling either, just following the natural progression of two people who'd decided they worked better together than apart. The place we chose was in Milwaukee, halfway between our jobs, with a yard big enough for copper and a workshop where I could finally spread out my tools properly. We'd gotten engaged quietly, no grand production, just a conversation on a Tuesday night about wanting to make this official. I proposed with a simple ring I'd chosen myself, and she said yes before crying and laughing at the same time. We planned a small ceremony for the following spring, immediate family and close friends, the kind of wedding that prioritizes meaning over spectacle. Rachel's parents flew in from Arizona and immediately loved copper, which she said was the real test I'd needed to pass. I heard through Marcus that Claire had moved to Seattle, finally leaving Portland and the wreckage she'd created here. He said she'd started therapy and was working on herself, though he didn't have details and I didn't ask for them. That chapter had closed so completely that updates felt like news from a foreign country I'd once visited but had no plans to return to. I wished her well from a distance and returned my attention to the life I was actively building. Margaret sent a card when she heard about the engagement, a thoughtful note congratulating me and saying she hoped this marriage brought me all the joy I deserved. She didn't mention Claire, and I appreciated that boundary. Whatever relationship they had now was theirs to navigate. My connection to Margaret had served its purpose, delivered the truth I needed when I needed it, and gracefully ended without bitterness or obligation. The wedding was everything it should have been, simple and genuine and surrounded by people who actually cared about us. My brother served as best man and gave a speech about second chances and building on solid ground. Rachel's sister read a poem about partnership that made half the room cry. We danced to a song we both loved, ate food we'd chosen together, and left early because neither of us enjoyed being the center of attention for prolonged periods. Our honeymoon was a week hiking through Olympic National Park, just us and the trails and conversations that meandered like the paths we walked. Rachel asked me once if I ever thought about Claire, and I answered honestly. Sometimes, but not in a way that hurt anymore, more like remembering a cautionary tale that taught me what to avoid. She nodded and squeezed my hand, and we kept walking toward whatever came next. Years folded into each other the way they do when life stops fighting you. Work progressed, promotions arrived, projects I'd designed got built and served communities. Rachel's firm won awards for parks that brought green space to neighborhoods that needed it. Copper got older and slower, and eventually we got a second dog, a younger rescue who learned gentleness from him. We hosted dinners, attended weddings, became the couple friends called when they needed advice about contractors or plants or just needed to vent. I never saw Claire again. Our lives had split completely, two paths that briefly overlapped before diverging toward entirely different destinations. I heard she eventually married someone in Seattle, had a kid, settled into a version of domesticity I hoped worked better for her than ours had. I felt nothing about that news except mild hope that she'd finally addressed whatever drove her pattern. Everyone deserves a chance to grow, even people who hurt you. Margaret passed away 5 years after our lunch, peacefully in her sleep according to the obituary I found online. I sent flowers to the funeral anonymously, a small gesture honoring the risk she'd taken to tell me the truth. Her honesty had freed me from years of self-blame and given me permission to rebuild without guilt. That gift deserved acknowledgement, even from a distance. Looking back at the whole arc, from devastation to reconstruction to genuine happiness, I understood something crucial. Betrayal isn't the end of your story unless you let it be. It's a chapter, painful and formative, but just one chapter in a much longer book. How you respond to it, who you become after it, what you build from the wreckage, those choices write the chapters that matter more. I'd been given truth wrapped in pain, delivered by a mother brave enough to betray her daughter's secrets for a stranger's peace. That truth had hurt, but it had also liberated me from questions that had no good answers. I'd taken that liberation and built something better, something real, something that honored the man I wanted to be rather than the man someone else's dysfunction had tried to make me. Rachel and I eventually bought that house in Milwaukee, planted trees that would outlive us, and built a life that felt earned rather than assumed. Every morning I woke up next to someone who chose me with full knowledge of who I was, and every morning I made the same choice back. That reciprocity, that mutual selection without illusion or deception, made all the difference. If betrayal finds you, remember this. The pain is temporary even when it feels permanent. The truth, however it arrives, is your ally even when it hurts. And the life you build after, informed by hard lessons and clearer boundaries, can be better than anything you lost. Not because the betrayal was worth it, but because you were strong enough to survive it and wise enough to learn from it. Start with truth. Protect your dignity. Surround yourself with people who tell you hard things. And when you're ready, build again. Build better. Build with someone who sees you clearly and stays anyway. That's how you turn betrayal into a foundation rather than a grave. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.